Hey folks, Seth Carmody here, VP of Regulatory Strategy at MedCrypt, a software startup aimed at making medical device cybersecurity easy for producers like medical device manufacturers. Been having this conversation with Mike Kijewski, our CEO, the course of a couple of months now about how much medical device security is enough. It's a very necessary question to answer. The answers are profound and complex. So we thought we might share a little bit of that conversation that we had with you and see what you think. First, in August 2021, this year, MedCrypt and I released a white paper entitled Why Healthcare Cybersecurity is Hard. And it details 6 constraints of what makes healthcare cybersecurity so difficult. The first constraint, maybe unsurprisingly, but vexingly, is that healthcare optimizes for healthcare. We must. If you look no further than the global pandemic, you want your healthcare systems to focus on remediating that particular issue. And we see that actually during that pandemic that the amount of attacks, since attackers exist, adversaries exist, the attacks on healthcare increased because they're focused on that healthcare problem. And the reason why the problems manifest for consumers is because of this idea of technical or security debt being architectural flaws, implementation, configuration, maintenance errors get passed to the consumer because the market isn't sufficiently incentivized to reduce that security debt, right? Consumers like healthcare systems, clinicians, patients must consume that technology in order to deliver healthcare, right? And their ability to exert upstream pressure on producers is limited. One, they're optimized for healthcare, right? Physicians and clinicians aren't necessarily security experts. So it makes it very difficult. And this idea of sort of negative externality or tragedy of the commons is exactly why we have regulators. So my job at the FDA was basically to say, hey, look, we understand that this is, suboptimal from a market incentive or force perspective. Let's consider some policy or additional legislation in order to sort of shift the idea of passing security debt to the consumer and make the manufacturer, the producer of that technology, responsible for it. And it's actually more efficient. It actually makes sense from an economic standpoint. The producers, consumers, HCOs, clinicians, patients, spend somewhere on the order of $10 to $20 billion per year on technology, services, fines for cybersecurity. Yet we see all the time in the news about these breaches, right? Incidences, problems are manifesting. We shift this idea, shift supply chain left, that $10 to $20 billion and invest that money, and yet in reduction of security debt as opposed to management of security debt. The idea is that then when it's sold to consumers, that they have a chance of actually securing it. So just because the regulator said, hey, look, we want you to shift left, and producers, manufacturers, you're now responsible for making sure that the technology is securable, right? From a technological perspective, the question becomes, well, how much is enough, right? And there's this 2 touch points that I want to make in the talk today. One is sort of how much should you be spending, and the questions around that. And the other one is really like, what should you be building, right? So there's sort of 2 fundamental questions. We'll touch on both a little bit today. But the idea that we want to start thinking or putting some thought experiments around how much we should be spending is what I'd like to go through today. So I'm going to lay out a couple of scenarios, a couple of sort of assumptions and general guideposts, but this all could be changed and welcome your feedback to do so. But we're making 2 assumptions here today: that security spend is a cost center, and that an organization's security efficiency or competency is suboptimal. In the white paper, we talk about the idea that security is a technically deep discipline. It requires very specialized people in order to give you a shot at reducing that security debt efficiently. And if you don't have that, and if you've optimized for, say, healthcare for decades, it takes some time, it takes some effort to actually increase your core competence such that you become efficient. So the assumption is that all these data points and dollars that we're hearing are from a suboptimized organization. So if you think about the total security spend, it should be roughly inversely proportional to the security debt. The more we spend, our security spend should be driving down security debt. Obviously, there's nuance in there, but there's some balance, right? We don't. How much do we want to spend? Do we want to spend billions of dollars? Depends on the size of the organization, what you're trying to do. You want to spend $0? Probably not. But this idea that where we should be making investments should be reducing the security debt, right? Not managing security debt. And the security debt is proportional, right? The idea that the more security debt that I have, the greater the probability of a money spent from market delays, whether that's getting through the regulator or selling to customers, or other forms of sort of pre-market dollar delays, dollar delay related dollars, plus some function of a probability of liability. And I mean liability in a very broad senses, right? The idea that you may be recalling devices, you may be making changes to devices that are on the market. There may be some legal liability due to the security debt in that device, but I mean that entirely broadly. So the idea that the more security debt that I have, the greater the probability that I'm going to spend money on this device, either before it reaches the market or after it reaches the market. So the idea that is I spend more, I should reduce the probability that I have market delays or liability concerns through the life of the device. So let's just say here, let's play around with a dollar amount just for purposes of argument that we take total R&D spend, we could take a fictional $100 million spend or the cited 2.5 billion at 0.5% is about $12.5 million per year total on security spend. Seems a little bit low, especially when we consider the fact that while I'm talking about, say, product security, that there's also enterprise security, right, defending your four walls. There's also manufacturing security, defending the four walls, where you manufacture the products, and then the products themselves, which are then sold to other organizations. 12.5 seems pretty low, but you know what? For purposes of argument, let's just play it out and to see if we can put some bounds around, additional bounds around it. So the idea that I have this component that I call the liability. Within that liability component really is this notion of, hey, I have things that I need to fix once they're on the market. So if I take two sort of use cases or two case studies, we take sort of a normal cadence operating system patching regime, like with Windows. So let's say the producer of a technology is using Microsoft's operating system in their technology. We know that updates and patches help us to maintain and increase security posture of that device once it is in use. Microsoft has a monthly patch cadence, 12 times a year. There's some cost to your organization, whether you patch it or you don't. You have to make some assessment, take in that information, make an assessment, and then sort of document what is done. In some cases, do validation testing and then roll the patch out. I've estimated that to be around $1 million per, I'll call it flaw, but in this case, we're taking some liberties with flaws in its definition. The idea that there's this discovery probability is also apt here, but we've assumed here that we know about these things coming out every month. So the discovery probability is 1 times 12 times a million, $12 million a year, just to maintain a single technology within a use scenario for healthcare technology, right? So it's already sort of making that 0.5% spend on security a little dicey. Let's carry this a little bit further. So let's talk about a different type of flaw, maybe like an architectural flaw. And we have anecdotes from being in this business for around a decade that when there are sort of not so getting off of the sort of a patching regime, it's not just a updated package that we need to go get from some repository. This is something that we've, for reasons that are perfectly rational, we may have chose, but turned out to be flawed in some way. We have to make some change, significant change to the device architecture. Let's say that over the course of the life, not calendar a year, but over the course of the device, excuse me, the course of the device's life, I have five of these such flaws. Anecdotally, we've heard somewhere on the order of $20 million to fix these types of flaws. There are fewer, but harder in terms of organizational effort to actually mitigate. If we have 5 of those flaws over the course of the device life, we're looking at somewhere around $100 million spend for a sold device. Excuse me. If we then apply that same thought process to the security, all of the security domains, meaning that not only do we have this sort of very granular look at device flaws, but we look at how we have to spend that dollar, that 0.5% across an entire vast discipline such as security. We have the security architecture, what we kind of cause, but what about risk assessment? What about governance? What about threat intel and security operations and then manufacturing? So it's a lot of things that $12.5 million or 0.5% has to cover. And most, almost just as importantly, the technology itself, drawing on the 7 properties of highly secure IoT devices, starting with hardware, the investment and thought and cost in the hardware, so that you as an organization can build on top features on top of that, or have features on top of that that foundation, so that you can have a secure system that's going to be a non-zero cost. What is that cost depends largely on you as an organization's core competency, right? So if you are focused on building clinical features and you are suboptimal in terms of core competency for security, building those things are going to cost you more. You can invest in building your core competency, but now you have to sustain and own and maintain that core competency. And you have to decide, just as other verticals have decided in terms of like data storage, and why AWS and Azure are so popular, is they decided that their core competency wasn't going to be data storage. Could they do it? Absolutely. Do they want to invest in it? Maybe, maybe not. So that concludes the talk. I hope I've given you food for thought, and you can think about how much security spend is enough for you and your organization. I'd love to hear from you. You can contact myself or CEO Mike here, and please check out our white papers. Thank you.